Welcome friend to this session of model view controller pattern. What we'll do is that what I've done is that I have divided the whole video into three parts. The first part which explains what is basically HTTP handlers. The second part then uses the HTTP handlers and shows that how we can build up a MVC application using core ASP.NET. And in the third part we have discussed about the ready-made framework which has been provided by Microsoft for MVC. Right. So what we'll do is that first we'll try to understand that what is the concept of HTTP handlers and HTTP modules. Now when a client sends a request for a .aspx file or for a .html or some kind of file type, right? You would like to implement some kind of custom logic before the request actually reaches the client. Now in order to inject this logic in between the request pipeline, Microsoft has given something called as the HTTP handlers. So what you can do is that you can inject handlers and map it to a ASPX file. So what will happen is that when the client says, okay, I want home.aspx, the handler one will run over the request and probably modify the request, redirect the request, or do some kind of custom logic or some kind of custom operation on the request, right? In the same way, you can map one handler to multiple file extensions like a GIF or a JPG. For example, you can see on the figure that we have mapped HTTP map handler 3 to two resource types, that is the GIF and the JPG. So basically you can say that handlers look at the file extensions, look at the request, and then injects himself in between the request, depending on the file type requested, it injects on the request, right? Now there's one more thing which is important, that is the HTTP modules. Now what happens is that basically when client sends a request for a ASPX file or for any file type, right, it basically emits a lot of events. So for example, some of the common events which I've shown on the video itself is that, like the begin request, authorize, or end the request when the request is ended. Now what HTTP modules does is basically actually listens to these events and helps you to write logic on those events. Right. So you can say that HTTP module is more event based, while HTTP handlers are more file type based. So you can say that modules can be injected before and after the handler, while handlers are injected or executed depending on the file type. Right. Now that we have understood the concept of HTTP handler, saying that okay, HTTP handler works on the file type, so it says that if you have a specific file type, you can inject a logic using HTTP handler depending on the file type, while HTTP modules basically listens to the events of the request pipeline and helps you to implement logic in those events. So what we'll do is that we'll take up a simple sample. So here's a simple VS 2005 application. What we have done is that I have created a handler and I have created a HTTP module. So I have created a HTTP handler and HTTP module, right? So in order to create a handler, what you need to do is that you need to first create a simple class of .NET, and you need to implement the HTTP handler, and you need to override the process request method. So here's where you will actually put your logic, here's where you'll put your custom logic in. Okay. Now once you have written the logic for your handler in the process request method, you can map this handler to any file type. So to map the handler to a file type, you need to make an entry into the web.config file. So for example, I have said, okay, my handler will execute when somebody requests for a .shiv file or a .querala file through the application, right? In order to implement HTTP module, it's pretty simple. Again, we implement the HTTP module. Interface, and then we can start overriding or we can start implementing the events which are interest of us. For example, I have implemented here the end request event and the begin request event. All right, and then once you have written the module, you need to just specify in the HTTP modules tag saying that we have something called as a CLS my module. So again, I'll just revise. To create a HTTP handler in ASP.NET, you create a class, implement the HTTP handler, put your logic in the process request method. Over here, now the logic which I've written is that I'm just logging something to a file, and I'm displaying saying that you have requested for this URL. So there's nothing big happening over here, but in real application, you can really write logic like authentication and authorization in this and make your ASP.NET application more decoupled. You can create in your ASP.NET application you can write your logic in a more decoupled fashion. I'm sorry, right. And in the second thing we have implemented is the HTTP module, and in this I have captured two events. One is the end request and the begin request. I'm not doing anything special here. Again, I'm just writing to a file saying that these events have occurred, right. So now we run the application. What I'll do is that first I will request for a x.shiv application, x.shiv file, because if you remember that in the web config file we have said that the logic in CLS myhandler will be executed only if a .shiv file or a .querala file is been requested. So I go to the website and I say I request me a x.shiv file. Now as soon as the x.shiv file is asked for, right, the HTTP handler comes in between and executes the logic. Means what happens is basically the process request logic runs, and in the process request we have said that you need to display, or you need to write on the context saying that what URL you have requested, and you can see that the same thing has been displayed here, right. And the HTTP modules have executed in the events. So now if you go and see the C drive file, the log file which we have put over here, you can see in the request log file that it has basically logged all the events. The HTTP module has logged the events of begin request and end request, while you can see that the page handler has logged saying that which page was requested. So in this way, what basically we have done is that now we can implement or inject logic in between the request. Now we'll use the same fundamental and see that how we can implement implement MVC using core ASP.NET framework, right. So let's see in the next session that how we can use the same HTTP handler session and implement MVC in ASP.NET.